So, well, if you recall, I had been playing with meditation for quite a while in different forms. And it was my experience with TM that also where I felt like I was truly meditating for the first time in some sense. I mean, it's a little bit better today, but you know, there's this word meditation, and you don't have a clear idea of what it is in terms of what exactly you're supposed to do, what does it feel like, all this other stuff. So TM gave me a really good experience of you know, very clear instructions of what to do, bit on the simple side, and gave rise to experience that came from it. And even in the very beginning, I could tell that it was beneficial to me in a number of ways. I think I became more relaxed, more receptive, and probably a bit less reactive as a result of doing TM for a number of months. When I started doing Buddhist meditation practices, that continued to improve, and it took on some new dimensions. Now, one of the things that I have realized is not very widely recognized within the larger meditation community is the importance and necessity of bringing the practice into your daily life. And this is something that long before I consciously thought that, well, this really, what does this really mean unless it produces changes in my daily life or my life experience off of the cushion. I had sensed real changes as a result of the TM experience. And so there was a certain unconscious and not clearly articulated realization of something. Now, this is the way I've put it much more commonly since I began teaching, is that, you know, it's a bit of a play on words and it's not quite grammatically accurate, but I say that's why they call it practice, because you're practicing for real life, right? So I always had an awareness of that, even before it became articulated. And I've always encouraged all of my students, anybody who's interested in meditation or doing meditation, that, you know, find ways to intentionally bring the practice into your daily life. So yes, it was making a lot of differences for me all along. Just to revisit who I was over those years and how I was changing. I was starting out from a very difficult background. I was not appropriately socialized for the strata of society that I had entered. I was ignorant of a lot of things that people learn as children and teenagers and young adults. I was bearing different kinds of scars. And so there were a lot of occasions for ups and downs and stresses and things like that in my life. Now, just to clarify, there are for anyone. And what I realized is that you don't need to have a challenging background for your life to be challenging and difficult to deal with, and not really able to cope in the best possible way. To paraphrase a little bit, actually it's to quote directly from what's his name? Just a tip of the tongue thing. Viktor Frankl. Everyone has their own Auschwitz, and it doesn't matter how ideal or otherwise your background was. You've got plenty of causes, but from my personal perspective, and regardless of the reasons, there were a lot of challenges in daily life, and personal interactions were difficult, and I wasn't terribly good at them and skilled at them. And I found I got better. I found I became more open and receptive and understanding, and progressively more capable of responding rather than reacting. So a lot of the things that were inherent to my meditation practice began to spontaneously manifest in my life. So there were many fruits of the practice of that sort, and progressively so for all of those years preceding any particular kind of attainment. And I don't really like that word, but say reaching any particular landmark in development, or landmark on the spiritual path. But the other thing, that had begun to happen as a part of my increasing skills at meditation were to begin to have more and more real understanding of what the Dharma was about. And this is what I've come to describe more recently as insight experiences, as distinguished from insight. And I would have these more and more frequently, and sometimes with greater intensity and sometimes less, sort of deeper realizations, just an opening up to a deeper understanding of things, which would then begin to inform my perception of reality in subtle ways initially, but had a cumulative effect. So although I had a stream entry, quote, experience that happened over a short period of time, I can see it as a culmination of a long process. There were these insight experiences. There was this growing understanding, less intellectual and more experiential, less intellectual and more intuitive, right? And being experiential and intuitive, these understandings came to be more of a part of how I saw things and experienced things as circumstances unfolded. So I would like to think that were I able to go back and survey or canvass the people around me, that they would report having noticed a lot of changes in me over the year. But nevertheless, I noticed a lot of changes in myself and my behavior and my ability to deal with things in a better way and to create fewer problems for myself. That was one of the biggest things. That's one of the most positive effects I think anybody experiences when they began to develop a clearer understanding of what this is all about. Their lives become significantly easier in many ways, less traumatic. One of the things that I began to do, and it's still a very well-entrenched habit for me, is I became very well aware that, whether it was a bureaucrat from the Department of Motor Vehicles or whether it was the grocery checkout person in Safeway or Fry's, or no matter where it was, that this was a tedious and difficult job and they weren't being paid a lot of money. And so, I just developed the habit of being genuinely friendly towards them. And if it was obvious they were having a hard time, or that the last customer, say something kind of cheerful, wish them a good day, tell them how much I appreciate any little thing that they would do for me. And
that can really brighten someone. One doesn't realize how much that can brighten someone's day. And what I like about it is it's not, as your practice progresses, these things are not forced or artificial. You genuinely can find there's some piece of goodness or happiness that you're able to share with that person in that moment, and you are in that way affecting the system, right? Even in the smallest way.
But especially I found it brightened my day.
Uh-huh.
I would
Yes.
walk away
Yes.
just feeling happier, more at ease, and more comfortable with the whole world. And I connected to somebody in a way, you know. Yeah, another thing that I found was really rewarding. My father had always been scrupulously honest, and I had known him to count his change and realize that, you know, a clerk in a store had given him too much money. He'd get in his car and he'd drive back to the store and find the clerk and say, you know, you gave me the wrong change. And I had a couple of occasions where that happened to me. And so I decided to do the same thing. I mean, I was as much motivated by the habit that I developed of being polite to cashiers and things like that, but polite and friendly and trying to make their day a little bit better. But then it was an opportunity, and I recalled my father doing this. And so I did this on a few occasions. And wow, did it ever make me feel good? You know, and it struck me, you know, in a way, this was kind of an insight experience. Maybe the flip side of insight into suffering, insight in, you know, happiness comes from within and not from outside. But it just struck me that by doing something like that, you know, an act of kindness for somebody else actually made me happier, made me feel better than if I'd been the recipient of it, or many of the other things that we typically try to do to make ourselves happy. One of the things that can most consistently and reliably put us in a better mood and make us feel good is to do something, some act of kindness, generosity, patience, you know, whatever it is, towards someone else. And that was a true insight experience.
I can really relate to that. But there's the other side of things. How did you deal with, because I mean, it's all fine when one has to be polite and nice and smiling and good to people and all of that. But how did you find yourself dealing with difficult situations, like when you had to be assertive or put down boundaries, which I know is something that you've said you've struggled with in the past? Because sometimes one cannot be pleasant in a situation, or sometimes one does have to stand up for oneself.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how meditation may have helped or hindered in that regard?
Well, because I had an impairment in dealing with those kinds of situations anyway, and I had other coping mechanisms and strategies that I invoked, which weren't that good, but seemed to deal with the problem. The main thing that I found that helped was, in those circumstances, regardless to whatever degree I hadn't really managed to establish boundaries or you know, stand up for myself or things like that, I would often go away very emotionally disturbed in one way or another, filled with regret, filled with anger, you know, different kinds of things like that. And where I found the big difference that resulted from meditation is I could feel this emotion. It's like something inside me climbing up and taking over, and I could see that, oh, geez, this is going to destroy the rest of my afternoon, or this is going to keep me from sleeping well tonight. And so what I learned to do in meditation, and what I would do, is just look at it and say, all right, you know, what can I do about this thing? I can't make it go away, but I know it's gonna make me miserable the rest of the day. And I would find that just by looking at it directly in that way, it lost a lot of its power. And so I began to do that more and more often. Anytime I found myself upset by what had happened. Now, I think that what most people would have experienced in addition to that, and that I did to some degree, is that it would become more skillful in dealing with the situation, and maybe not have such a bad experience, maybe not manage the interaction so poorly and have as much cause for your own emotional reactivity. But somebody with better boundary skills and not so conflict avoidant, I think they would have found a very similar process taking place. They would recognize the emotions, the problems, the reactivity and reacting in the same way that they always had was producing, and that this would allow them to make greater changes in their behavior. And I have seen that. I've seen it's one of the things. A lot of, it's interesting. One of the things that a meditation teacher finds himself or herself doing a lot is helping a student appreciate how much benefit they have gotten from meditation, how it has changed. People will get discouraged because they'll have a certain kind of expectation or goal that is not being met, at least to the standard they would like it to be. And so, you want to talk to them and help them recognize, well, so I sort of ask leading questions and probe and things like that, and try to get the person to recognize and start telling me about, well, oh yeah, since I've been meditating, this has changed. I get along better with my family, don't have so many, my teenage son, I don't get mad at him as often, or when I do, I don't, I control what I say a lot better. But so I've seen that just the fact that meditators often need someone to help them recognize the benefits. I've been able to hear people articulate to me the kind of benefits that they received in meditation. And looking back at it now from the perspective that I have today, I can recognize just how effective it is in helping people to, people who are a little bit better psychologically adapted than I was, to modify their reactions, to mitigate their reactivity, and to be able to respond more. Now, of course, I did describe that in TMI in The Magic of Mindfulness, which is a chapter that I like to redo, because I think most people, where it's placed in the book, they read that and then they forget about it.
And certainly this seems to be one of the problems, is that carryover into everyday life where people don't consciously try to do that. Right. When I finish a sit, I always say to myself, now, whatever's been generated here, remember to take this with you when you get up off the cushion, as much as, and revisit it during the day. Because you get some people that feel like they make no progress in meditation except on retreats. So they hardly ever bother in between. They're retreat meditators.
Right. Yes, and that's very unfortunate. But yeah, the process of, you, as you say at the end of your sit, you tell yourself that you want to remember, and you actually go through all the same stages that you did with sitting meditation and paying attention to the breath. You get up from your meditation with this intention, and if you meditated in the morning, then in the evening it's suddenly likely to hit you that, wow, I didn't do that all day. Well, that's the equivalent of forgetting and mind wandering. And as you persevere, you get better at that. It becomes, the periods of time during which you forget to bring what you can do in the practice and the attitudes and into your daily life. But you get better and better at it. You progress through the same stages. Over that decade of the 1980s, I had a lot of life opportunities to, and before that as well, but I'm just sort of focusing on that one period from, say, when I moved to Vancouver to 1989. I had lots of opportunities to appreciate the benefits and to apply the benefits of meditation in my daily life. I had withdrawn from one career path. I'd experimented with another one with a bookstore that hadn't worked out. I'd moved to Vancouver. And so the 80s was trying to begin fresh, not knowing where I was going, but it was having to basically create a whole new life for myself. It also coincided with the end of my second marriage and a young son. And I handled that so differently than I had the end of my first marriage and loss of contact with my first son. I made sure that wouldn't happen. Over the course of those years, I mean, I suppose I was a little bit out of hand and heavy-handed in the way that I made sure that my now estranged wife and my son moved to Vancouver because I had. And that could probably be criticized. But once that happened, you know, I maintained close contact with her, and I had close contact with my son. Most of that time, he was either living with me half the time, and for a really large part of that, he didn't live more than half a block away, and my ex-wife and her boyfriend would spend Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners and things like that with Nancy and I. I maintained that connection. I did so much better job of that. And I dealt with the ups and downs of trying to find both a Dharma path and a career path, having let go of so many other things earlier. I handled all of those things, you know, in retrospect, so much better than I ever had previously. And I know without a doubt that was a direct result of my practice. Right. And over that decade, as my practice progressed, so did my ability to deal with the issues of life and relationships.
Mm-hmm. So I think the important thing here, and that's why I wanted to have this little discussion, is that there is so much benefit to be derived even long before stream entry, right? And also the way that you've described it is that all along the way, this is all part of the awakening process. It's not like that there's just this moment of awakening. Everything that precedes it is part of that, of the awakening. Isn't that right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think you've segued now nicely back into 1989. I think I'll just ask you one little question there, if that's all right. And that is, when your stream entry experience happened, where would you place yourself in the TMI stages at that, in terms of, you know, your powerful mindfulness and stable attention, and sort of, could you give us an idea for TMIers to know stage-wise where you were around that time?
Well, at that time, I didn't have the benefit of the clearly defined stages to, I mean, I hadn't written the book yet. I wish I had, but I wrote the book based on all this. And where I was, I mean, in some aspects of my practice, I had lagged behind, but I had it enough together that I was definitely practicing post stage 7. Okay, so I was definitely had entered the realm of the adept
meditator. Yeah,
adept meditator. Although some of my skill sets had not been as well refined as I've tried to guide people to do so in the Mind Illuminated. But yeah, I was, in terms of the practices I was doing around the time and at the time the stream entry occurred, those were stage practices I described in stage 8 and stage 9. Whereas I'd say I didn't really have the degree of effortlessness and the degree of stability of attention. I mean, the Vipassana factor was very strong, and the sati, the introspective metacognitive awareness were very, very strong, but there were certain deficiencies that I had, and I'd skipped over certain things based on the TMI model. But that's roughly where I was in a week stage 7 and doing stage 8 and 9 practices, a bit out of order.
No, and that makes sense. And I think a lot of TMI practitioners will know that as clearly as you've defined the model, that is not exactly how the practice unfolds. There will be certain skills that we will be stronger in earlier on than others. And there is a constant refinement taking place. And that ideally, it sounds to me like what you've said in the past is that your whole aim with writing TMI was to get people to stage 8 to effortlessness and to have these certain basic skill sets available to them. And then after that, you know, people will kind of be able to guide themselves to some extent.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So there we are. It's do you remember the exact date, just by the way? Do you have like your own private body day?
No.
No.
I don't.
Yeah.
Closest I can come is my son was born at the end of May in 1989, and it was sometime that fall. The important thing is that I arrived on the cushion that day with a lot of things that had happened over preceding days and weeks and months, well, years, in fact, that had been leading up to this point. It was, yeah, there were a lot of things that just hadn't come together yet, but were wonderful and insightful and valuable in themselves. And as best I can recall, my sit seemed very ordinary. Maybe I probably was more clear and maybe, yeah, I think that it was maybe a little bit out of the norm in the degree of clarity that I brought to the sit immediately. But I can't remember enough of the specific details. But it was like the experience was consciously, I was doing meditation as usual. It seemed, though, as if there were very important processes taking place at an unconscious level. And there was this coming together of all of these different things that had accumulated over time, these different realizations, these different perspectives, that they coalesced, they came together. And there was a moment when it came into consciousness, or you might say that there came into consciousness the realization that something very special and unusual had been and was happening. A very tranquil and beautiful, but yet a certain kind of expectancy. It's when the rain's going to come in any minute, or something like that. That almost as if you're in a suspended moment of time. And the most significant thing was afterward, the intense feeling of joy and happiness, and everything was just so, all of this understanding was so clear. It's like I was seeing, like my eyes had been wiped clear of some kind of obscuration, and just everything fell into place, and everything looked, it was so obvious. And it was amusing how I had struggled to understand these things for so long, and they were so obvious. It's so, it's just like, oh my goodness, and that glow was that was a tremendous glow. That was one of those days when I did have to teach. I did have to work. It wasn't, I think I mentioned to you that I'd always arranged to have a day when, my son would go off to school and Nancy would do her things, so on and so forth. But this was a day that I had to go work. And so I doubted somewhat whether I would be able to teach my classes. I was teaching 3-hour classes, and I was teaching 2 of them a day. But I was able to, and I was able to do it from this wonderful kind of metacognitive place, and being in that place didn't interfere at all with my ability to do exactly what I had to do. And I did it very joyfully and happily. And at the same time, I was sort of not only immersed, but above the whole thing. And it was just this beautiful day of, and every experience I had, everything I looked at, everyone I talked to, it was like, yeah, now I understand. Now I see. And I'll just add to that. In subsequent years, of course, I looked back on how wonderful at the time, and how it was wonderful, and how clear, and how, what a tremendous shift in perspective was. But I can look back at that person and say, hey, he had no idea.
It's amazing to me how, I mean, it's 30 years ago. You look back on that experience now, and you are still smiling and giggling about it. And,
Right.
so it does sound like it was really quite wonderful. And amazing that you could go on and just teach afterwards, which was another thing. I've listened to Brad Warner as a Zen teacher, and he talked about something similar. He said on his way to work, he had this awakening moment, and he went on and went to work and went on with the rest of his day. But I suppose, would it be fair to say that it's ordinary people? I know it's not on the same scale at all, but sometimes you have this really good day and you're just feeling wonderful, and nothing can spoil your mood. Doesn't matter whether someone cuts you off in traffic or you have to stand in the queue for an hour. Everything is just fine that particular day. And it sounds like it's to some degree, at least the experience of it is that many times magnified.
Yes, very much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you know whether at the time you thought, well, okay, now it's happened, this thing that I've been working towards, now it's happened, or whether you had already at that stage realized that you're going to, I think you said in one of our earlier interviews, you said you would just hold these things lightly because you'd had experiences before that didn't stick, so to speak.
Yes. Well, it was, I could not avoid thinking about, asking, is this stream entry? What is this? That sort of thing. And it was too powerful not to realize it was something very important and significant. But yes, I had a lot of previous experiences where I realized that the way things felt and what one mind could make of them really went beyond whatever shift had actually taken place, And so yeah, I did hold it lightly. I didn't speak to anyone about it for a very, very long time before it's like I felt very much to have to have spoken about it, or even to have put it into words in my own mind, would be a big mistake. The worst possible thing to do, because it would stop this process. It would interfere, at the very least, it would interfere with that. And now I can understand very much, yes. As soon as my, conceptual mind, my intellectual mind began to create a story about this and labels and concepts and things like that, it would be creating exactly the kind of obstacle to clear experience of what was really happening that creates the need for awakening in the first place. I mean, we are trapped in dreams and nightmares of our mind's own making. It is the mind's, it's the papancha, it's the elaboration, even the confabulation, the stories and the what ifs and maybes and all those other sort of things, tainted by fears and hopes, desires, aversions, all of these other kinds of things. It can so rapidly develop, take a life of its own, and blot out the very thing that it's trying to understand. And I had a very strong and wise intuitive sense that, gee, I just didn't want to do that to this thing. Later on, I can look back and I can say, yes, that's exactly right, because it is exactly that. I would have been invoking exactly that mental process which created the obscuration in the first place. And now I had dropped it and seen beyond. And there would be a time for that kind of conceptualization and verbalization, but this was not it.
It's almost like you want the cement to set first before you start walking on it.
That's one metaphor that works. And the other thing is, you want to let the flower continue opening before you start messing with it.
Yeah. So over the next few months, it sounds like there's an integration process also happening, as well as a sort of a blooming of knowledge. Yes. So how did this affect your life going forward? What happened next after that, over the next few months? Because life went on, it's presumably. You carried on teaching, you were still seeing your son, you were still... So how did the story unfold from there?
Well, in terms of external circumstances, it seems like a lot of things in my life were just falling into place and working out a lot better. Of course, in retrospect, I can realize that it was because I was much happier. I was much less stressed. I was much more capable of bringing these various skills that I had developed into action in my daily life. That was why things were getting. That was a big part of why. I mean, some of the things had nothing to do with me and any kind of internal shift, but on a daily basis, I can recognize that I didn't think of it in those terms at that time. I tried not to think of it at all, but looking back on it, I can realize that my daily interactions with the people who in one way or another were involved in the changes that took place, like I say, my life just kept getting better and better. And I was much happier and much more at ease. My interactions and different ways of responding rather than reacting, and all of this stuff contributed to my life entering into a very wonderful phase. I ended up in the 90s, before I left to go live in the mountains, making more money than I ever had before in my life. Having a much better quality of life in so many ways. I was incredibly healthy. I met and interacted with people that introduced me to all kinds of exciting and wonderful things like woodworking and fine woodworking, canoe building, canoeing, all sorts of things. I'd always had a phobia of water, and someone who became a really dear friend of mine for a long time was probably one of the world's best whitewater canoeists. And he wanted me to try whitewater canoeing and teach me and all that kind of stuff. I didn't tell him my fear of water, but I was in a mindset that, hey, let's see what we can do about this. And I overcame my fear of water.
Wonderful. So it seems like your internal world was changing, and that was changing your external world, which was changing your internal world, and they were going back in that classic systems way of looking at things. Did you keep meditating? I mean, this is one of the things that some people talk about, is that they say after this experience, they sort of go, well, I've kind of arrived, and they no longer have this desire to keep practicing.
That's right. That's what happened to me.
Talk about that. Yeah.
So much better. I was so much happier. I actually felt like I had access to the kind of understanding that I've been seeking all of my life. That I did. It just, the fire was gone. The motivation wasn't there. And actually, I got the motivation was there. It just became redirected, and it was in a good way. I had always struggled to reconcile the magical aspects of Tibetan Buddhism with the very the Theravadin Buddhism, which was so much the opposite of it, and that tantric Vajrayana Buddhism was so different than anything. The entire Mahayana was very different than anything that is in the suttas as they've come down to us in the Theravada version. So when the opportunity arose to learn more about shamanism and the shamanic side of things, I embraced that totally. Time that I had previously spent with meditation and Dharma study and things like that began to shift into, began doing training with Michael Harner and core shamanism, and with some of his senior students who were teaching who lived much closer. Actually, Nancy and I were the active sponsors. We used the facilities at the college I was teaching at to offer courses in shamanism, and bringing in much more skilled and knowledgeable teachers than ourselves to actually lead these workshops. Formed shamanic groups and met regularly and practiced various forms of shamanism. And of course, being the kind of person I was, I began to study the different. Michael Harner taught core shamanism. It was distillation of all these different shamanic cultures. So I, of course, went the other way and started, well, where does this core shamanism come from? What is the version of it that's present in this group and that group and things like that? And that led me into a lot of Native American religions as well. And one of the things that I discovered very early on is that North American indigenous peoples didn't really practice quite the same shamanism. As a matter of fact, from the technical definition of shamanism by Michael Hartner and a number of other people, you would have to say that Native American traditions are not really shamanic at all. But certainly some of them, Hopi and the Navajo in particular, become very close to that. Even closer are some of the tribes in Mexico near the border with Arizona and California. And anyway, and that also led into a return and interest in medicinal plants, peyote, San Pedro, mushrooms, all of these things. So I kind of drifted away, not completely, but compared to where I was before, it was quite a deviation away from Buddha Dharma and meditation practices to exploring all of this other side of things. Now, shamanic practices have always involved plant medicines, even though Michael Harner intentionally minimized that. The plant medicines used were different in every culture. Now, here's an interesting thing about shamanism and Native American traditions. Native American traditions were sufficiently close. They were very animistic and naturalistic. They were very close to being shamanic, according to Michael Harner's definition. In the latter part of the interaction of Europeans and Native Americans, they gave birth to a truly shamanic religion, the Native American teepee ceremony, the peyote ceremony, the peyote cult, the peyote religion, all these different names that it's called by. That is a truly shamanic practice. It wasn't characteristic of Native Americans 100 years before that, but it arose, and it borrowed as much from Christianity as it did from anything else. But it became very powerfully shamanic. The traditional sweat lodges and things like that took on much more shamanic aspects. And I attended a lot of teepee ceremonies, and not only attended, but conducted San Pedro mesas and things like that. So, yeah, I was still motivated to learn and discover and integrate the things from my past, but I wasn't nearly as focused as I had been for the preceding, decades.
Yeah. So, to bring this back to one of our earlier discussions, where we said the fire had now been put out on your head, right? And that sense of urgency was not there anymore, because you'd had this. Sounds like a massive relief that had taken place, and you could really start. Yeah, and you could actually start enjoying your life a lot more. It does sound like you got a lot out of studying shamanic religions and practices. Were you still during this time just continuing your work at the physical medicine college and all of that stuff?
I was continuing to work and teach, and I remained very active in the various, Physical Medicine Research Foundation and various other things that I had been instrumental in putting together. But part of the shift that took place was, now at this point, my oldest son was in high school. We had a what they call an in-law suite or a mortgage helper in the basement. And by the time he was going to high school, we let him have that as his own private apartment. So I had this very idyllic situation. Had a good career, lots of momentum, making a lot of money, comfortable and happy. But I had this feeling that it was time to move on, to make another shift. The reason I mentioned my son is he was basically living with us full time for those years. Now I'm talking about, we moved to Arizona as a family in 1996. And so I'm talking about 1990 to 1996. Everything's coming together, more and more feeling like, okay, it's pretty much done all I can do in this arena. Mm-hmm. It's time to move on to something else. And what else? Well, I don't really know, but I used a lot of shamanic journeying and things like that to find my direction. When I left Arizona as a child, I had made resolution that, basically lived with me my entire life, that I was going to go back when I could. Now, once I had a son, Charles, my middle son, it became clear that that couldn't happen until he had graduated from high school and had a life of his own. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I told Nancy when I agreed to get married is, says, you have to know, when Charles graduates from high school, I'm going to Arizona. So you're going to have to be willing to do that. She said, sure, I've always loved the Southwest. So, Charles was in high school, and everything, it was just, yes, that time is approaching. So I began consciously preparing for this major shift. This came to talk about it as just jumping off the edge of the world. Didn't know what was going to happen or anything like that, but looking for a piece of land to buy in Arizona, thinking in terms of just starting something completely new, mostly. Once again, I never lost touch with Buddhism, and in a sense, the whole exploration of shamanism had originated with an attempt to more completely understand Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism and Tantra and all of that, which had helped enormously us. And so during the course of the first half of the 90s, it's like a lot of other things were coming to fruition, and it's like I was ready to go back to a much greater immersion in Buddhism and meditation. So I began to think of what we were going to do was we're going to go off and find this isolated place in the desert or the mountains or wherever we found, and it would be a life devoted to spiritual practice to a much greater degree. I didn't know what form the in the world part of it was going to take, but we were going to do this as a family. So, yeah. So I was still going to be in the world. It wasn't going to be, a withdrawal from the householder's life.
Right. Just remind me again, because I'm a little fuzzy on this. Is you had 2 sons or 3 sons at that?
3 sons. I had
Sorry?
3
sons. 3. And could you so the first one was Charles?
No, the first one, his name is John.
John.
He's the one that I never had contact with.
Much contact with, right? And then the second son was?
Charles.
And then the third son was Sean.
Charles was born during that year of seclusion in the mountains.
Right, yes, in the cabin.
And Sean was born in 1989.
Right. Oh, yes, in May 1989. And so Sean was, 6 or 7 years old when you decided to make this massive move to Arizona.
That's right. He was 7.
He was 7. And that was your and Nancy's son.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
And so you decided, okay, we're going off. I've done what I can do here in terms of my career, and I want to now devote myself more intensely to my spirituality. I do have one little aside question. If you were interested in Tantra and Vajrayana and those traditions, why not study those directly rather than studying the shamanism, which seems like it's at a bit of a right angle to Buddhism?
Because in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, it was not a right angle at all.
But why not just study Tibetan Buddhism? I meant.
Because I had already studied that and couldn't unlock it. So
okay.
Like with everything, my approach has always been, okay, let me go to the root of this thing and work my way up until I can understand and make sense of it, which I was totally able to do. The things that I learned from Michael Harner, just almost from my first contact with him, began to answer a lot of the questions, the irreconcilable conundrums that I had come up against in trying to understand Tibetan Buddhism.
Right. And during that time, were you not, you weren't involved in it? I mean, I don't know what it was like in 1990 to 1996. Were there temples? Were there Buddhist organizations that you were part of? Or was this still something that you were figuring out on your own in your own way?
Well, I was still mostly doing it on my own. There were, for example, in Vancouver, it has a large Asian population,
Yeah.
and so there were a lot of Asian Buddhist temples. There were small groups of Western Buddhist practitioners beginning to form over North America, and naturally there were some in Vancouver. There was there was a bookstore there in Vancouver that carried a huge selection of spiritual books and became a center for not only the New Age, but the serious Buddhist practitioners who were. And I would have to include my personal Sangha in those. Members of the Namgyal Sangha had established retreat centers on one of the Gulf, the first one was on one of the Gulf Islands, but it didn't take long before there were others. So things were beginning to happen. I was still very much on my own path, affiliated with these others, interacting with these others, but I've never been a big joiner.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. But I mean, and that's the reason that I brought this up, because in the 90s was when the stuff started becoming more mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream in the West, and organizations were starting and teachers were more readily available and books were being published. So one would imagine that there is this temptation to get involved in that, but you had your own path kind of laid out for you, that you knew which way you wanted to go.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So 1996, I presume you gave up your jobs in Vancouver and off you went to Arizona, or how did that all unfold?
Well, for one of the things that my circumstances at the time were that I had a summer break, about almost 3 months in the summer. Well, part of the summer break I had to, I was an administrator as well as a teacher, so I had to do things before classes actually started. But I had a long break in the summer, and then every Christmas I would have 2 or 3 weeks that I could go away. And so in those years, where I would go every summer and every Christmas break would be to Arizona, and part of that was looking for a suitable place to move to relocate to. And in the course of that, later in the process, it began to approach the time when Charles would be graduating from high school and we would be able to make this move. Nancy joined me on that. Actually, what happened there? We went, I can't remember quite what time of year it was, but I think it was summer. It was summer. So together with my parents, who lived in Arizona and who I had reconciled with and everything by that time, Nancy and Sean and myself and my parents, we went on a camping trip together. My parents had a big van that they could stay in. We visited several places, and one of the places we visited was Cochise Stronghold Canyon. This is a place that I knew extremely well from my childhood. We used to go there on Sunday afternoons and have picnics. It was a favorite place for the family to go. And in all of those trips, in all of those years, I always made a point of going and spending time and camping in Cochise Stronghold Canyon. Well, this time Nancy was with us, and so we did go and camp in Cochise Stronghold Canyon. It was It was a very mystical kind of experience in a lot of ways. We'd been coming down out of a different mountain range, and some truck had had a big bag of dog food had fallen off the back of a pickup, we assume. So we picked it up and we put it in our vehicle. We ended up in Cochise Stronghold, and there were all kinds of animals and wildlife there. So we ended up feeding dog food to the wildlife, and well, there was just a lot of wonderful experiences happening. The next day, as we were preparing to leave, or the day after, and I don't remember whether we stayed there 2 nights, 1 night or 2, but as we were preparing to leave, Nancy said, I could live here. And I said, well, a fat chance of that. There's no land for sale here at all. She said, well, let's go and check anyway. So we went into the real estate agency in a nearby village of Sunside. And sure enough, there was 15 acres for sale. It was more than we could afford, but we somehow managed to, something you're not supposed to do, but we managed to find out the name and address of the seller. And so when we got back to Vancouver, we contacted the seller, said we would like to buy it, but we couldn't afford to pay the price that he was asking. This was a year and a half before we moved. I guess it was a warm December. It must have been a warm December. Yeah, that's right, it was. So we got in touch with the owner of the property, and he responded by saying, I'm taking it off the market. It's no longer for sale to anyone but you, but no, I'm not going to lower the price. So over the next year, we had put up a topographical map, actually a 3D topographical map with a pin in it where that property was, right in Cochise Stronghold Canyon. And we were in communication with the owner of the property over the course of a year. From our side, always trying to find some way to negotiate a lower price. From his side, he was trying to be accommodating, but he wasn't going to accept a penny less. So he said, well, now it's not listed. I'll take the 10% vacant land real estate fee off the price. So the price came down by 10%. But he wouldn't do more than that. But you know, we had kind of a relationship, and he kept expressing this wish, this very strong wish that we be the ones to buy it. I don't know what his thoughts were or anything, but it was rather dramatic that he had taken it. It was no longer listed. He'd taken off the market to anybody but us. I can say there was something magical about the whole thing. Well, the following year, and it was December. The following year in December, I returned to Arizona. This time I was by myself. I didn't have either Sean or Charles or Nancy with me. And the first thing I did was I did a ceremony out in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert outside of Tucson, a little place belonging to friends of ours. And in that ceremony, I had a very shamanic ceremony using psychoactive plants. I had a very strong vision, and it was very, very clear that I was meant to buy that property, that we were meant to buy that property. And that was the place we were looking at. Basically what I was told, this was a powerful vision. I was told that is intended for you, and you'd better take it. You know, this is what's meant to happen, and it's like, it's up to you. You'd better do this because this is what
your bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So from there, I proceeded to go back to Cochise Stronghold Canyon. I basically trespassed on the piece of property that we were interested in. I spent the night there. I put my sleeping bag down under a big juniper tree. And I just, I did a lot of shamanic and certain kinds of meditation practices that were conducive to this at the time, and developed this incredibly strong resolve. So I got in touch with the man who owned the property. He lived in Sedona. My parents lived very nearby in Camp Verde. So we arranged to meet the next day at a little restaurant outside of Sedona. My father joined me for that. So I went back that night, stayed with my parents, and then went to meet him. We ended up, I had no idea how I could pay for this, but we ended up writing a contract. I mean, it's classic. With a pencil we found and on a paper napkin. The restaurant was actually closed, as it turned out. We wrote an agreement, which he took into the title company in Sedona that day, or the next day. No, this was on a Sunday, so he did it the next day. I had to start driving back to Canada. It's a 3-day drive. So I had agreed to purchase this property for more money than I had. He had offered to, as a part of his offer, he said, I'll finance it for you, nothing down, and, this is how much you have to pay. This left, the payments were small, and they left a large balloon at the end. I think it was a 7-year term. But when I got back to Vancouver, my first day back at college, a friend of mine who'd been aware of everything that had been going on this last year. He and his wife had both been aware of all of this. We were pretty close friends with Nancy and I. And of course, he had been a student at the college, and then he had joined the faculty at the college years later. So I'd known him for a very long time. Anyway, they knew we were moving to Arizona, wanting to move to Arizona, trying to find a property and all of this sort of stuff. They knew about the particular property. They knew about all the negotiations with the owner of the property that had taken place. And so I got back, first day back, Ron says, let's go to coffee. We go to coffee. He says, so tell me what happened. Well, I said, Ron, you're not going to believe this, but, I told him what happened. I said, I don't know how I'm going to pay for it because, it had only been the last few years that I've been making money. I'd started putting money away into retirement plans and things like that, but it wasn't that much. It wasn't enough because not only would I have to pay for the land, but have no income, trying to, empty, vacant wilderness, trying to make a home for a family in wilderness with no money. Anyway, Ron says, did you ever consider taking partners? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he and his wife had been talking about it. And he said, maybe we would go halves on it with you. That's kind of amazing, isn't it?
That is pretty amazing. Yeah.
This was another instance when I was camping in the stronghold the night before I met with the owner of the property. I had recalled Goethe's quote, which I think I acquainted you with early on.
Yes.
And I said, this has always worked in my life before. This is what my shamanic practices were telling me, to go ahead, don't worry about it, to do it. And even stronger than that, the vision that I'd had a couple of nights earlier had said, you'd better do this, is what you're meant to do. So it was even much more strongly stated. So, I basically read and reread and thought about and, essentially memorized that night the quote from Goethe and acted on it, and all of these things fell into place. Like a week later, I have Ron saying, we'll go halves on it with you. We actually flew back down to Arizona 2 weeks later. Ron and his wife and myself and Nancy and my father met us there. And they had never been to Arizona before. They'd never seen this place, but they came down and looked at it. We talked about what we could do with it. And it all came together. It did. It all came together. So 6 months after that, we moved.
Wow. But you're saying that this was basically empty wilderness. There was no, there was no housing on it. There was nothing.
There was a well. That was a wonderful
Okay, there was a well.
And there was a falling down shack.
Yeah.
It had been an orchard back in the 40s.
Yeah.
And it had been a shack that the caretaker of the orchard lived in.
Yeah.
But it was falling down, things like that. But no, there were no amenities. It was completely overgrown.
Wow. So I'm just thinking, what was your plan? I mean, you had this other, so now you have this other couple who have jointly financed buying this place with you, buying this empty land, beautiful but empty, in the middle of the wilderness. You've got Nancy and yourself, and what was the plan here? What were you going to do? And how did what I'm interested in is, how did Nancy decide she wanted to go along with this? Because she did say, well, I could live here, but doing what? I mean, what was the plan moving forward?
Well, we didn't really have one. The closest we came is we speculated about a lot of different possibilities.
Yeah.
The four of us and the two of us, we really didn't have a plan, but we were able to speculate about enough different possibilities that we felt confident that we'd be able to do something. Actually, my confidence that we could do something didn't derive from that at all. It's just like, I'm going to do it. So of course we can do it because we're going to do it.
Would you mind me asking what were the options that you were considering? Because that sounds mad to me.
One of them we considered was providing some kind of accommodations for people that took different forms. But one of those forms was that we'd put up some cabins and we'd rent them out so that people could come and stay. And of course, there's the upfront cost that you've got to build the cabins and all of that. Yeah. But of many different scenarios we looked at, that's one that looked like it might be pretty good. So we took the step of putting a rough plan of this together and taking it to someone at the county planning and zoning department to look at and talk about the possibilities of doing something like that. We were doing this from Canada, of course. Yeah. Now, one of the problems with that is that for some reason or other, somebody in planning and zoning office, I know they had friends who owned property in the canyon or something like that. Nobody lived there at the time. When we moved there was one person living there. Well, no, there was always one person. It was kind of a hermit that lived a little further out the canyon from us. But at the time we moved here, there was another mountain man who'd been living in a cave who'd moved into somebody else's cabin there right adjacent to us. But people owned property there, and somebody from planning and zoning had gone to them and let them know what we were asking about. They had mistaken that we were actually doing a formal application for a permit to do this. And they actually were violently against us. Who are these Canadians coming in and they're going to defile this place and turn it into some big tourist attraction? And I mean, they blew it up. And all it was just an exploration of a possibility, nothing else.
Mm-hmm. And this is, you'd had some experience with this before, with when you'd lived in the cabin and taking care of people who had stayed in nearby cabins, right?
Hostels, yeah.
Yeah.
And a little bit of experience. And the other experience we'd had was in Expo 86, which was held in Vancouver. We had provided accommodations for the city, opened up in order to be able to accommodate all these visitors, that all of the residents would be allowed to rent rooms to visitors from out of town. So we did that during the expo in the 80s. So we also had that other aspect of experience in this as well. So between those two things, we weren't totally devoid. I mean, it was something that had a little bit of tangible familiarity to.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still a pretty far out idea. Well, the other thing I did is, since I was planning to leave my employment and everything, is I talked about it and with the college, and their first reaction was, "This is going to be a disaster for us. We're not going to be able to replace you very easily." And so what I countered with is, well, I could still come back and work the equivalent of 6 months of the year. And that could help you, move on to get to a place where you move on without me. I did that for the next 4 years. I would go back to Canada and stay 2-3 months at a time. And, the cumulative total would be about 6 months. Right. And of course, I was always on call. Even when I was in Arizona, I was doing a lot of the same administrative work just by computer and telephone, things like that.
Yeah. And so by the time we've basically run out of time for today, but by the time that 1996 came around and you moved to Arizona, what had you settled on doing in Arizona?
Nothing.
Nothing yet.
We didn't know. We had ideas. The reaction from the community sort of precluded building the cabins that we talked about, but we still had a whole bunch of ideas. I did at least have 6 months of ongoing employment at a much, much lower income than before.
Sure.
So, that's what we had, but we had no clear idea at all of what we were going to do.
Wow. So really just always, this seems to be a pattern in your life, is that you often just jumped into something with this kind of faith that it is going to work out in the end. And sure enough, it seems like it usually did. And the other idea, so you had the cabins. What else were you thinking about with the land? And then we'll leave it there, and then next time see what you actually ended up doing.
Well, the other part of it for me, and I don't think Nancy and Sean quite saw the same things, but I pictured living extremely simply, very primitive lifestyle that wouldn't require, now, of course, you have to consider the value of the American dollar back in 1996, but I was envisioning a family of 3 being able to live on not too much more than $1,000 a month. And that level of simplicity didn't come about, but my desire for simplicity and seeing that as a really viable way of making this work persisted. Nancy was, of course, never, probably no woman ever would be comfortable with the level of simplicity that I was envisioning. And certainly my 7-year-old son, who he'd been in grade 2 in Vancouver in a school district in a very nice middle-class neighborhood, and all the friends and all the fun places to go in the city and everything like that. It was both Nancy and Sean they weren't ready for the degree of simplicity and everything that I was ready to embrace.
Right.
I'd lived in the mountains for a year, basically on nothing.
Right. Yeah, you'd had experience of this before, and sleeping on a mattress and all of that. So, yes, so it does, that would necessitate quite a different, this was very appealing to you, but for the average person, that seems like quite a hardship. And again, when I've been reading these stories about Zen masters living in caves and living on, a handful of berries a day kind of thing, and they seem perfectly happy. But for the average person, this is not an appealing prospect to have to live, so barely.
I always felt like if I could conceive of 2 feasible ways to do something, that I would discover at least 4 more once I started doing it.
Okay. Right. And how does that relate to what we're talking about here?
Well, that I was willing to jump in not knowing clearly what was going to happen.
I see.
knowing that simplicity was one approach to solving the problem, and that there were others that we had talked about, maybe not in the form of building a bunch of cabins, but there were others. So yeah, the degree of austerity that I would have been comfortable with was extreme.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I could see that as one potential means. And like I say, I had learned by then the lesson very well that nothing ever happens the way you expect it to. None of your plans are really what's going to happen. But like I say, that if I can think of two ways something might be feasible, then I would discover several
more would come up. Yeah, more would present themselves. Absolutely. Well, I think that's. I think we've covered a good chunk of stuff today, and I'm interested to hear the next bit. So we'll carry on next time with your life in Arizona, which I'm very looking forward to. Yeah. Thanks very much, Culadasa. Thank you.